The Edo period of Japan spanned from the early 1600s to the late 1800s and brought an age of stability to an otherwise broken nation. Before the Edo period, Japan was in the Sengoku period. Known as the Warring States or Civil Wars period, Sengoku translating to belligerent country, it was a time of great war. The emperor usually only had as much power and control over the country as far out as a day or two's journey from the palace. So Japan was broken up into many smaller lands owned by daimyos or feudal lords. Usually the people living on the land feared the power of the daimyo more than they did the power of the emperor. So Japan's three reunifiers, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, worked together to bring the warring daimyo under one central power. The Edo period, also known as the Tokugawa period, starts with Tokugawa completing this task and become a shogun, as declared by Emperor Go-Yuzei in 1603. He was the head of the Tokugawa clan, whose symbols were dragonflies and the triple hollyhock, as shown on this fancy kabuto, which is a type of military helmet for decoration. The three reunifiers were each powerful warlords that had different styles and characters. There's a famous verse taught in Japanese schools today where the three are asked what each would do if a bird shown in front of them, the lesser cuckoo, also known in Japanese as the totogise, that's why it's repeated, what each would do if a bird shown in front of them would not sing. So it goes, Naknu nara koreshite shimayo totogise. If you don't sing for me, kill it. And that's said by Oda Nobunaga, and here he's showing his strength and determination. He was arguably the most potent and most fierce samurai in the era. And he was also known for his cruelty and was often described as a demonic figure with no mercy. Nobunaga essentially defeated the warring daimyos of Japan. The second line goes, Nakanu nara nakasete misyo totagise. If you don't sing for me, I'll make you sing. Said by Hideyoshi, and here he's showing his tactics and strategies and his cunningness. He was the successor of Nobunaga, and he finally unified Japan and brought essentially the end of the Civil War era. And the final line goes, Nakanu nara nakomade matou totagise. If you don't sing for me, I'll wait until you do. That's said by Ieyasu, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and he's known for his patience for a long-term success. He was the successor of Hideyoshi, and he was the founder of the Edo shogunate. So presumably he's the most famous shogun in history, and Ieyasu was known as a patient, persevering man with an excellent talent for management. He was the one who finally completed the unification and created the government, the shogunate. There's another popular saying, sort of reminiscent of the saying "you can't have your cake and eat it too." It goes, "Orogatsuki Hachiba ga konishi tenkamochi surishimama ni ku wa Tokugawa." Nobunaga prepared, which what he prepared, it's in the next line. Hachiba is also another name for Hideyoshi. He needed the world rice cake. Tenkamochi means, mochi means rice cake. You guys probably know about it. It's like a rice cake filled with sometimes ice cream or bean paste. And tenka means world or globe. So putting that together would mean just kind of like the world rice cake, referring to Japan because many people in Japan at the time hadn't left or seen anything else outside of Japan because of their isolationist policy, which we'll get into. So when they say world rice cake, they mean the world. They mean Japan. And the third the third line says, and the one that sat down and ate it was Tokugawa. Another version also says, and Tokugawa eats it, as it is Tokugawa. So it's both a criticism of Tokugawa while at the same time criticizing those who, Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, for being ambitious and seeking unification, but not really being able to follow through to create a sort of lasting alternative. So those men labored really hard to put this rice cake together. Nobunaga literally doing the work of two men, as is shown here twice. They worked really hard, and they ended up not even getting to eat the cake. The saying could also be taken to praise Tokugawa for his wiseness, because being patient is essentially what gets you most in the end. Patience is virtue, after all. So as the stability is brought to the nation, a greater expression in the arts and in luxuries was developed. One long-standing aspect of these bombastic displays of power from the figurehead class, more on that soon, is Nikko Toshogu Shrine. It is a Toshogu shrine called Toshogu because it was created by the Tokugawa clan, and it's located in Nikko Tochigi Prefecture, Japan. It is a Shinto shrine, and the suffix gu indicates that the shrine enshrines an imperial prince. This suffix of a Shinto shrine usually indicates the status of the shrine. So Tokugawa Ieyasu was deified with the name Tosho Dai Gongen, which means the great Gongen, light of the east. A Gongen is believed to be a Buddha who has appeared on earth in the form of a kami, which is a spirit to save sentient beings, and this is what gives Toshogu shrines their name, as they are dedicated to Tokugawa Ieyasu, the first shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate. Shinto religion worships many kamis, and at this time, Buddhism and kami worship were essentially inseparable, and kamis began to be seen as those who had reached enlightenment and had returned to save others from the illusion of the world. Nikko Toshogu, Tokugawa's remains are also entombed. Iyasu's son, the second shogun Hidetada, ordered the construction of the Nikko Toshogu, and later the third shogun, Iemitsu, had the shrine greatly enlarged and lavishly decorated. During the Edo period, these shrines reached 5,000 in number, but after the Meiji Restoration, which was the next period, many were abandoned and others united with other shrines in the area. Presently, they're estimated that there are about 130 Toshogu. They're usually all dedicated to Tokugawa Ieyasu, but Nikko Toshogu is the only one that has his remains there. So these shrines are usually commissioned by the figurehead class, but who were they and what were the other classes? So the main basis for the balance of power were Confucian principles of social order, and that's pretty much what built up this caste system. The main in a document titled Tokugawa Ieyasu on military government and the social order, it is written that on the subject of the emperor, the shogun, and the farmer, he said, whether there is order or chaos in the nation depends on the virtues and vices of these three. This diagram here shows a good summary of the social dynamic of the time. The emperor was given virtually no power, but he held a high prestige in the eyes of the people. The Japanese emperor is similar to today's British monarch in that both technically do not dictate within the law or the government, but while the British monarch can exercise her power in an emergency, the Japanese emperor literally he cannot. This status of the Japanese emperor still exists today, where the emperor is limited to the ceremonial and cultural role. It was written in the Constitution of Japan following World War II, which fun fact, it was written by the Americans, that the emperor is a symbol of the state and of the unity of the people, deriving his position from the will of the people with whom resides sovereign power. Can anyone remember? It's a little bit reminiscent of a line from an American legal document that kind of voices a similar belief. Can anyone think of it? Pause here. So this is reminiscent of the line from the Declaration of Independence: governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So both are suggesting that the power of the king and the government really just comes from the people. So, and sort of along the note, the court nobility, or the kuge, were similar to the emperor because they were high in prestige and cultural influence, but little to no actual power. The shogun was the de facto ruler of the Edo period. Even though he was below the emperor and the court nobility, he was in charge of the military and was the actual ruler of Japan, because Japan was kind of ruled by the military at this time. The daimyo were below him, around 250 feudal lords that were in charge of land around the country, but they answered to him, which was different than before during the Sengoku period, where they kind of all were their own masters. And they usually had annual outputs of 50,000 or more bushels of rice from the people living on their land. The upper layers of the social classes, so these four, were prone to an elaborate interest in the arts, like elegant architecture, landscape gardens, and patronage of the arts, all elements which can be seen in the temples. The shogunate had an interesting way of keeping control over the daimyo so that there wouldn't be any rise in power, returning the country back to a civil war. Their families had to reside in Edo. Edo was the capital of Japan, later renamed Tokyo during the next period, the Meiji Restoration, while the daimyo had to reside in Edo for 1 year and in their province or the land that they owned for the next, and keep alternating. So the system was called Sankin Kotai. Next were the samurai, around 400,000 warriors in numerous grades and degrees. Most were foot soldiers, although some were eligible for high office. After the end of the Sengoku period, after all the daimyo had essentially been defeated, there was very little fighting during the Edo period, at least at first. So the samurai became civil servants paid by the daimyo with minor duties, with a chain of command, like most militaries. Before the Edo period, samurai owned their own land. After Tokugawa became shogun, their daimyo took over the land, giving the samurai two choices: either give up their sword and become peasants, or move to the city of their feudal lord and become a paid retainer. This was difficult because samurai usually lived with legacies and they were really connected to their land, but in the end, you kind of had to submit to the government at the time. Or there were a few samurai who remained as direct vassals of the shogun, the 5,000 who were called Hatamoto. And some of them also made up of the Shinsengumi, who were also direct samurai for the shogun. So the samurai, combined with the classes above them, made up Japan's ruling class, about 6% of the population. Now on to the lower classes. You had the peasants, the farmers, craftsmen, and merchants, and they were held in respect for their job of producers, or at least the craftsmen and the farmers were, but they were the chief source of taxes. In the document mentioned earlier, the one about social order, Tokugawa had said, as the people produce clothing, food, and housing, which are called the three treasures, they deserve our every sympathy. As shown here, the third line. Also, it's sort of funny, Koroshodan literally means old man talks, which I think is really funny. Just a side note. Right, so this is consistent with Lao Tzu's philosophies, where a job in agriculture was considered the best profession. However, there's also contrasts with Lao Tzu on the topic of artisans, mainly, who he considered useless. At the beginning of the Edo period, the peasants, farmers, craftsmen, and merchants were mostly illiterate and lived in villages where their taxes were collected by appointed individuals who kept the peace. This family was the smallest legal entity. The individual had no really separate rights. So whatever your family or your clan, or mostly your clan was, that was your class. And this kind of has this special significance. It kind of breaks the rule a little bit, because outside of these classes is kind of a secret class, not even shown on this triangle, were the Eta and the Hinin. So these people had professions, or family had professions, that broke the taboos of Buddhism. Eta were, some examples of Eta were butchers, tanners, and undertakers, and some Hinin were town guards, street cleaners, and executioners. Eta literally translates to filthy and hinin to non-humans. I believe that Mozi would heavily disagree with this, as he believed we should practice universal love, which the Edo period did not extend to these people. Usually these are people, the Eta and Hinin were people who were considered also to be tainted with death. Japanese culture considers death major taboo. For example, does anyone know why the numbers 4, 24, 42, and other numbers like that are considered majorly unlucky in Japan, even though 42 is the answer to the universe? Pause here. The word for 4 and the word for death in Japanese have basically the same pronunciation, shi. So 24 can become nishi, aka double death, and 42 can become shini, or death, or die. So not super great. And so this kind of taboo with death really affected a lot of these people of Eta and Hinin. They usually weren't allowed in the whole city. They were only allowed inside a special part of the town or city, and they weren't allowed to wear robes longer than knee length or hats. They weren't allowed to engage with the government or the upper classes, which is probably why there is absolutely no mention of them in Tokugawa's document on military government and social order. Mobility between social classes didn't exist in the beginning of the Edo period, because if there was mobility, the point of creating the social system that made sure people knew what they were doing, opposed to before when people were just kind of trying to survive, if there was mobility, the point would kind of cease to exist. But I mean, again, kind of breaking that rule, within Eta and Hinin, there were subclasses. There's a little bit of mobility. There were the people that were born into Eta or Hinin families, and they couldn't leave the classes. But those who had lost their previous class when they had taken an Eta or Hinin job could be reinstated in Japanese society. Little bit of a cautionary note. There's another term used for Eta and healing people that you will usually find when doing research or reading about this topic on English sites. However, it's treated in Japan as an illegal, discriminatory term, and it's offensive. So, I mean, in English, it's technically correct. It's also correct for the time, but in Japan, it's really, you don't want to use that word. So, the respectful term that should be used, the Dowa people. The term Dowa meaning sameness, showing that the Dowa people are the same as any other Japanese person. This is trying to combat discrimination, but the change hasn't really been translated to the English side of the internet, but at least you know. Anyway, officially the caste system was officially abolished in 1871. However, discrimination of people with a Dowa background or Dowa job still occurs today. So, for example, in the mid-1970s, a Dowa rights group uncovered a 330-page handwritten list of names and community locations of Dowa people that was being sold secretly to employers by mail order. Many influential Japanese firms were using the list to screen job applicants. Another thing was on Google Maps around 2009, I believe. On Google Maps, you could see where parts of Japan that were labeled as Dowa areas, which sort of continue to perpetrate this discrimination, which was highly disrespectful. One reason for the lasting discrimination could be the association of Dowa communities with the Yakuza, or the Japanese mob. It's estimated that a third of Yakuza comes from Dowa communities who were drawn to the organization when other jobs or companies wouldn't take them in. Discrimination still lingers with jobs that were formerly considered Eta or Hinin today. Nikko Toshogu, shown on the right, left his job as a computer programmer to become president of the Shibaura Slaughterhouse Union, and also to be closer with his kids. He says that I remember once when my wife and I were visiting with some of her father's relatives. When I told them what I did, they stopped pouring me beer. So because he works as a butcher, or he's president of the Slaughterhouse Union, he was considered to be kind of lesser than others. Thankfully, with initiatives being put into place and organizations fighting for Dowa rights, the Japanese community is becoming more and more accepted. The strict caste system that didn't exist before the Tokugawa Bakufu, also another name for shogunate, arguably led to a bustling economy. The elite were relatively educated, agriculture was productive at first, and the nation was finally unified with developed financial and marketing systems and even a national infrastructure of roads. Oh, great. Urbanization went into effect and trade grew, even foreign trade initially. And even while commerce was flourishing, the shogunate remained in their belief that hard agricultural work was the basis of society, and never sought to switch to, or never wanted essentially to switch to, a mercantile or capitalistic country, continuing with Confucian and Lao Tzu's beliefs. So with a peaceful country where people can actually get work done and not worry about dying as much, at least, farmers prospered. Rice production steadily increased as rice paddies grew from 1.6 million cho in 1600 to 3 mil by 1720. The cho was part of the traditional Japanese units of measurement, or the shakaho. The Imperial Japanese government adopted the metric system after the Meiji Restoration, and commerce today in Japan has been legally restricted to using the metric system. Still, the traditional system is still used in some instances, like with carpentry and agriculture. So one cho is about 109.1 meters, or about 358 feet. So rice paddies grew from about 175 million to 327 million meters. The increase in rice production also came from improved technology, which helped farmers control water to their paddies. Pop quiz. Does anyone remember what Sankin Kotai is? Or can anyone define what it is? Pause here. To recap, Sankin Kotai is the system where daimyos had to live between two residencies, one where their land was and one in the capital city of Edo. So with all this moving back and forth, the consumer market grew in Edo and trade throughout the country developed. So of course the merchants benefited greatly from this big trade boom, especially those who had official patronage from those in the upper classes. However, problems arise, especially from three groups. Number one, the samurai, who were forbidden to engage in farming or business, but they were allowed to borrow money, and they borrowed too much, which, can you blame them? But they borrowed too much, so they had to take up side jobs or as bodyguards for merchants, debt collectors, or artisans, which would lower themselves in the caste system. Their financial trouble also undermined their loyalties to their feudal lord and even the shogun. Second group that had troubles were the daimyos, who raised taxes on farmers but did not tax business, so they too fell into debt, especially with merchants who were specialized in loaning to daimyos. So, here's a question. Why didn't the daimyos tax business? A little bit of a hint, the caste system. Pause here for thoughts. So the general thought was that taxing business would make money off of parasitic, I'm doing air quotes, you can't really see them, parasitic activities, and raise the prestige of merchants and lower the status of government. Getting more taxes apparently means you're more prestigious, even though the most prestigious people of all, the court nobility and shogun and the emperor, didn't get taxed. So there's that. The merchants started to earn more and more prestige on account of their wealth anyways, and they even started to get power of the daimyos. And then the peasants and the farmers, the brunt of taxes pretty much fell upon them, inciting unrest and revolt. So it's a difficult question. Are there any ideas on how to fix this? Pause here. Here are a few that were implemented at the time. A few shoguns tried to cut off samurai salaries and prohibited spending for luxuries. Relatively successful, but, had a lot of grumbling involved. Another tried to modernize with further technologies to improve the productivity of farms, as mentioned earlier, or slightly mentioned earlier. For example, a man-made aqueduct called the Minamarai Yosui was constructed on the orders of the 8th Tokugawa shogun Yoshimune. Completed in 1728, it extends it extended 52 miles and delivered water to approximately 37,000 acres of farmland in what is now Saitama Prefecture. Other shoguns lowered the value of the coinage to pay debts, which caused inflation. The coinage of the time was mainly made out of gold, silver, or copper, and alloys of the three to make different valued coins. Seen here is an oban, one of the largest coins of the time, worth about 10 ryos or 1,200,000 to 1,300,000 Japanese yen, or around 11,029 to $11,948. Fun fact, that coin, or another coin a little bit smaller called the koban, is what is usually depicted on the collars of lucky cats, shown on the right, also called maneki neko. They also originated around the Edo period in Japan rather than in China, as is sometimes believed. Anyway, by 1800, the commercialization of the economy grew more rapidly away from the agricultural base, which conflicted with their Confucian views. The rigid class system broke down because of this, because as the merchants gained greater political influence, samurai and merchants began to not only flip-flop in terms of status, but also they began to intermix, and it was easier to move between classes. In the later part of the Edo period, the lower class as well as the higher classes were able to participate in the economy more than ever before because they now had the means and the leisure time. The search for enjoyment became known as Ukiyo, translating to the floating world, which was considered to be this ideal world of popular entertainment, fashion, and aesthetic products. Music, kabuki, or theater, poetry, and literature were among these products and entertainment, but a mixture of many of them could be seen in art, with a higher demand in terms of visual art. With a higher demand for art than ever before, from more classes than before, artists began to be able to experiment with new art styles and techniques. Ukiyo-e was one of them. Ukiyo-e translates into pictures of the floating world, ukiyo being floating world and e being pictures. And they originally depicted scenes from the leisure districts of Edo, as well as Japanese aesthetics of beauty, nature, and entertainment, etc. Originally, ukiyo-e meant something completely different. Japan has three writing systems: hiragana, katakana, and kanji. So, you know the writing that looks kind of like Mandarin characters sometimes? That's kanji, and it looks that way because kanji did come from China. Kanji can be written differently, but pronounced the same way, which is going back to this superstition for the number 4. They're written different ways, 4 and death, but it's pronounced the same way. So it's the character itself that holds meaning, not necessarily the way it's pronounced. Which also makes names difficult, because names usually are made up of kanji rather than hiragana, which hiragana is for specific sounds, not so much individual meaning. So by combining uki for sadness and yo for life, the word originally reflected the Buddhist concept of life as a transitory illusion. However, during the early Edo period, another character which meant to float and was similarly pronounced as uki came into usage, and the term was associated with wafting on life's worldly pleasures, which is a whole lot more fun. The piece here, which is really popular and famous. I think a lot of people have probably seen it. It's titled Takayasha the Witch and Skeleton Spectre by Utagawa Kuniyoshi, and it depicts both a historical and mythical scene where the real-life 10th century Princess Takayasha on the left summons a skeleton specter to frighten Oya no Mitsukini to avoid being detected. Oya no Mitsukini and a companion. The historical part, in a nutshell, is that Takayasha's father was an insurgent to the Japanese emperor, who was in Kyoto at the time. After he was beheaded, Takayasha went into hiding, and Mitsukini is searching for any surviving members of the clan. This, coupled with the skeleton specter, would probably also be a popular theater piece, which is where most probably the idea for this art piece came from. Ukiyo-e was created as a collaboration between 4 people. The artist used ink on paper to draw the image and then transferred the art onto thin, partly transparent paper. A craftsman pasted this thin paper onto a wooden block, usually from cherry wood, and followed the lines on the paper with a chisel and cut the original in negative, meaning that the lines and areas to be colored were raised. A printer applied pigment to the carved wood block, and pressing the wood block on the paper and rubbing a round pad over the back made the print. A publisher oversaw and coordinated the process, as well as marketed the works. So I've got a video here. Look, it's a very long process, and there are videos on YouTube. I have them linked at the end. One of them is it's in real time, 3 hours long. There's another 17 minutes, but I chose the 1-minute one really, really fast, just so you can kind of get like a snapshot of it. And if we pause the video here and go to the slideshow, click on this image, it should be linked. A signature of ukiyo-e was the triptych. Not to pause the video again, but does anyone know what a triptych is? Pause here. A triptych is an art piece made up of 3 pieces, and it's spelled triptych. It's made up of 3 pieces, usually put together side by side to display a single image or event. And that's what ukiyo-e was usually. It was usually 3 pieces, and that's why maybe on the top, if you've noticed, on the top I have pieces of ukiyo-e, and usually you can see, especially in this slide as well, you can see that they are slightly put aside, and that was customary at the time to have these 3 separate parts. And also you could find that the artists usually put little like signatures on each, just to make sure that, even if only one survived, you could tell that this was the work of this artist. Ukiyo-e is usually divided into 2 categories. There's the original drawing and the woodblock print, or the print that's made from the woodblock. So the original drawing was created as this single piece of work, and it made it really expensive. Woodblock print benefited from the fact that it had a kind of stamps to make it readily available, and the same picture could be inexpensively printed off many times. So even the general public, even those that weren't quite wealthy, could easily buy ukiyo-e. And as a result of this, there were a lot of different versions. So there were individual works like the ones shown here, but they also served as illustrations for kusazushi, Japanese chapter books, emakimono, illustrated scrolls, and kawaraban, commercial news sheets of the Edo period. There were also picture calendars called Egoyomi, shown on the right, which included works with diverse ideas. For example, in the one pictured here, the men are the large months and the women are the small months, and that's talking about the number of days. And there are words here to help kind of figure out which ones are which. There's a child who represents the 13th leap month. There's a leap month at the time that was added when it's kind of confusing, when there are 3 lunar months between a lunar month, which includes a solstice or equinox, and the following lunar month, which includes also a solstice or equinox. It's confusing. So it's amazing that they were able to keep track of time. The clothes that people wear are also themed around the months, and I think it's really, really fun. As souvenirs for Edo as well, ukiyo-e could also be appreciated due to their beauty and sometimes small size. There was a type that was used for, like, you guys know of, in sometimes school, like, kids magazines, like Scholastic, I think, had some, or you could, like, buy them from a book. There were, like, cardboard or paper that you could cut out and put on stands and kind of put them as like toy dolls. There's a version of this. At the time, it was called Omocha-e, and it was toy pictures for children, and that's shown on the left. So the mass production of woodblock prints in the Edo period was due to the high literacy rate of Japanese people at the end of the Edo period. Remember how earlier most people were illiterate? At the end, the literacy rate of the Japanese in the Edo period was almost 100% for the samurai class and 50 to 60% for the farmer and the more peasant classes, due to the spread of private schools called terakoya, which prospered again because of leisure time. There were more than 600 rental bookstores in Edo, and people lent woodblock printed illustrated books of various genres, as mentioned earlier. In terms of characterizing ukiyo-e, in terms of expressiveness, it's characterized by clear-cut design, daring patterns, shadowless expression, and flat color. So there usually wasn't much shading involved. And not much anatomy, not super detailed anatomy. There's also a type in which perspective was intentionally ignored. So, for example, a figure, a little bit here, but a figure in the distance was conversely depicted as larger when it should be smaller than whatever's in the front. Woodblock printing was also used widely around the world. Black and white block books, where a full page would be carved onto wood, appeared in Europe in the mid-14th century. Usually both the text and the illustrations were cut into the wood, but some contained only illustrations and the text would be added by hand. These black and white block books were almost always images interpreted from the Bible or other sources of medieval religious thought. The images were meaningful even to the illiterate, bringing religious education and sermon to many more than before, and they aided clerics and preaching monks to make their sermons more interesting. Illustrations were commonly colored by hand, if they were colored at all. So on the left is a story about Adam and Eve, and on the right is talking about the apocalypse. The left is more understand, like you can tell that it's Adam and Eve. On the right, a little less apocalyptic, but certainly there. Woodblock printing is also used to this day in Jaipur, India, where cotton fabric is stamped with color using hand-carved woodblocks. The color is made with natural plant dyes and mordants, which are metallic salts that both create color and allow it to adhere to fabric. So when I went to Jaipur, like a few years ago, I bought a few hand-printed textiles, and if I was in class today, if I was in person, I would wear it, but I'm not, and also it might be really hot. It is when I'm recording this. So here's a picture on the right. On the left are some examples of the wood blocks that would be used. And you can see they're usually patterns. And on the right is my skirt that I have. And as you can see, it's a little, you can see that the colors are just a little bit deviated from the lines. And that's because there were two separate blocks. There was one for the lines and one for the color. Utagawa Hiroshige was one of the last great masters of ukiyo-e. His prints memorialized everyday life in the late Edo period, in which travel and entertainment became more widely available to the middle class. His work had widespread appeal within Japan and also abroad, with European artists adopting both his bright colors and his theme of the fleeting, the ephemeral. Hiroshige was a member of the Utagawa school. The Utagawa school comprised dozens of artists and stood at the forefront of the 19th century woodblock prints. Particularly noteworthy for the theater and historical prints, for example, from earlier Princess Takayasha and Scout Inspector, that was made from a member of the Utagawa school, theater and historical. But members of the Utagawa school are nonetheless well versed in all of ukiyo-e. During Hiroshige's time, the print industry was booming and the consumer audience for prints were growing rapidly. Prior to this time, most print series had been issued in small sets, such as 10 or 12 designs per series. Increasingly, large series were produced to meet demand, and this trend can be seen in Hiroshige's work, like the 100 famous views of Edo, which we'll see a few pages from in a bit. In terms of, or you know what, actually, I can show now. In terms of style, Hiroshige is especially noted for using unusual vantage points, seasonal illusions, and striking colors. In particular, he worked extensively with the realm of Meisho-e, pictures of famous places. During the Edo period, tourism was also booming and leading to increased popular interest in travel. Travel guides abounded, and towns appeared along routes such as the Tokaido, a road that connected Edo with Kyoto. In the midst of this burgeoning travel culture, Hiroshige drew upon his own travels as well as tales of others' adventures for inspiration in creating his landscapes. So here there are over 100 views in this book, and you should really check it out. I'll have it linked at the end. Really, really beautiful. And usually it's from all four seasons. You got spring, summer, autumn, winter, and these are pretty much all famous places. After the opening of Japan to the rest of the world, after 2 centuries of seclusion, which we'll talk about, ukiyo-e prints were brought back in hordes to the US. So originally, though, aside from Dutch traders, Westerners paid little attention to Japanese art before the mid-19th century. And when they did, they usually didn't see it as any different from any other art from the East, kind of all blended together. So when these prints were brought back to the US, reception was pretty mixed, but even when praised, it was generally thought inferior to Western art, which emphasized mastery of naturalistic perspective and anatomy. At the time of their introduction to the West, woodblock printing was the most common mass medium in Japan, and the Japanese considered it of little lasting value, as it could be just replicated at any time. Writer Edmond de Goncourt and art critic Philippe Berthet coined the term Japonisme around this time, which is a French term referring to the popularity of Japanese art and design in the 19th century, after it started to gain notice at the International Exhibition of 1867 in Paris and became fashionable in France and England in the 1870s and 1880s. Hiroshige especially played a prominent role in shaping Western perceptions of Japanese art. And it also, he and Ukiyo-e particularly influenced art of the early Impressionists of Western art. Early painter collectors incorporated Japanese themes and compositional techniques into their works as early as the 1860s. For example, there are the pattern wallpapers and rugs in Manet's paintings, and they were usually inspired by the patterned kimonos in ukiyo-e pictures. And there are many, many different artists. For example, Degas and Cassatt depicted fleeting, everyday moments in Japanese influenced compositions and perspectives. Here's a little tiny game. Who is this artist? We can pause here. I'll give some hints if it's needed, but I don't know, maybe you'll be able to figure it out. So pause here. Hint number 1. He's a Dutch post-impressionist artist. I don't know if that means anything to you, to any of you. Vase with 15 sunflowers and Starry Night. Pause here if there are any more guesses. It's Vincent van Gogh. Woo. So Vincent van Gogh copied 2 of the 100 famous views of Edo, which were among his collection of ukiyo-e prints. He once said, "I envy the Japanese for the enormous clarity that pervades their work. They draw a figure with a few well-chosen lines as it were as effortless as buttoning up one's waistcoat," said Vincent van Gogh in a letter to his brother Theo in 1888. So you can see and then Bridge in the Rain after Hiroshige by Van Gogh. So there was a lot of this sort of replicating pieces from ukiyo-e, or at least implementing aspects of it. For example, Hiroshige's style also influenced the Mir Iskutstva, a 20th century Russian art movement in which Ivan Bilibin and Mstislav Dobuzinski were major artists. Dobuzinski confessed of Hiroshige's influence, "I like to choose a viewpoint of my own so that the composition would be striking, unusual. In that, I had a constant example of Hiroshige before my eyes." These are just like a few of the great artists that took inspiration from ukiyo-e. There are many. I could get into it forever. Despite his productivity and popularity, Hiroshige was not wealthy. His commissions were less than those of any other in-demand artists, amounting to an income about twice the wages of a day laborer. In 1856, let's go back a bit. In 1856, Hiroshige retired from the world, becoming a Buddhist monk. This was the year he began his 100 famous views of Edo, shown here. He died at the age of 62 during the Great Edo Cholera epidemic of 1858, and whether the epidemic killed him or it was due to not the natural causes, it's unknown. And he was buried in a Zen Buddhist temple in Asakusa. Just before his death, he left a farewell poem. Azumaji ni furi o nokoshite, tabi no sora nishi no mikuni no meishi o mimu. I leave my brush in the east and set forth on my journey. I shall see the famous places in the western land. In this context, the western land refers to the strip of land by the Tokaido between Kyoto and Edo, but it also does double duty as a reference to the paradise of the Amida Buddha, who is the main figure in Pure Land Buddhism, where the belief is that there will never be a land that is not corrupt, so the goal is to be reborn into a different plane, the Pure Land. So by now, I've mentioned Japan's seclusion at this time a bunch of times, but what is it? So the policy was called Sakoku, and it was enacted by the third shogun, Tokugawa Iemitsu, at about, I believe, in around 1630. It was the closing of Japan's docks to the outside world, where virtually no foreign nationals were allowed into the country, and Japan's residents weren't really allowed out early either. And Sakoku was made up of numerous edicts and policies in around 1630. Although we can back up a bit, Japan wasn't completely isolated. It was earlier believed to be a complete seclusion, but it technically wasn't completely isolated under Sakoku. There was trade with China with strict regulations, and the policy stated that the only European influence permitted was at the Dutch factory at Dejima in Nagasaki. The Chosun Dynasty Korea also traded with Japan, and Western scientific, technical, and medical innovations flowed into Japan through Rengaku, which was Dutch learning. Trade with Korea was limited to what is now part of Nagasaki Prefecture. So the way this kind of worked is that the trade was limited to certain ports and for certain countries, but it still prospered. Even as the shogunate was restricted to certain ports, they were able to still gain a lot of trade, and even as they expelled the Portuguese from their ports, they simultaneously engaged with discussions with both the Dutch, Chinese, and Korean representatives to ensure that the overall volume of trade did not suffer. So because of this, recently scholars today have started to move away from the term Sakoku, which implies a totally secluded country, and to the term Kaikin, which means maritime prohibitions. The shogunate imposed its Sakoku policy mainly to remove the colonial and religious influences of Spain and Portugal, or of Christianity, and this was seen as a threat to the stability of Japan. The increasing number of Catholic converts was concerning to the shogunate, which was another reason. There was another reason that was a little more political. By restricting the daimyo's ability to trade with foreign ships coming to Japan or pursue trade opportunities overseas with the Tokugawa Bakufu, could ensure that none of the lords could become powerful enough to challenge the government's supremacy, which was the rationale essentially for Sankin Kotai. So this was more on the down low. The main reason, at least shown to others, was they tried to remove the colonial and religious influence of Christianity, but it was probably still there. The Dutch and the English were generally seen by the Japanese to be able to separate religion and trade, while the Spanish and Portuguese were kind of looked at with suspicion. The Dutch, of course, supported this belief, probably because they were eager to take trade away from these two superpower countries. An instance that is said to have triggered the imposition of Sakoku was the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637-38, which was an uprising of 40,000 mostly Christian peasants. In the aftermath, the shogunate accused Christian missionaries, of instigating the rebellion and expelled them from the country. He strictly banned their religion, Christianity, on penalty of death. So many Japanese Christians formed underground communities, becoming what is called kakure Krishitan. Practices would vary by community, some becoming more syncretic, mixing Shinto and Buddhism and Christianity to create sort of like a mix. Like there is sort of a form of Mary that is a mixture, and you can see that there are sculptures made of her kind of in the style of you might see of Buddhist sculptures. Some would drift away from Christian teachings and become more of like a cult of ancestors, mainly worshiping their ancestors who were Christian martyrs. So here you can see that there is a kind of a statue of Buddha, but on the back is a cross, so this was there to kind of hide their religion. There are several elements to the end of the period. There was the forcing open of the docks to the west, Sakoku ended after 1853 when a certain Commodore Matthew Perry forced Japan open to American and effectively Western trade through the Convention of Kagowa. So this foreign intrusion put a lot of stress on an already straining country. Peasant uprising and unrest from too much taxes was already happening, and merchants were gaining too much money and disrupting the caste system. And there were 20 great famines in the late Tokugawa period, as well as the aforementioned plague that occurred during Utagawa's time. So a wealthy farming class emerged as the previous noble families started to lose rank. The loyalties of samurai wavered as they fell on hard times due to debt, and the shogunate was blamed for dishonoring the emperor and impoverishing the people. While all this is happening, the emperor is still there. He's still having a mostly good time. And they tried to reassert dominance by the modernization and fighting against insurgents. Modernization, as talked about before, was for example, was adding the water system to farms, but still modernizing with ideas from the West, especially the Dutch, and working with foreign powers, especially after Sakoku had been abolished. The Bakufu was a target of anti-Western sentiment, and there were a lot of clashes there. Interesting how anti-Western sentiment, while originally wanted in the point of Sakoku, kind of hurt the shogunate in the end. And it was abolished after the Boshin War in 1868 to 1869, where the reluctant head of the Tokugawa house, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, abdicated, and the power was restored to the emperor, who was Emperor Meiji at the time. And Emperor Meiji was the sort of the still was a descendant of Emperor Go-Yusei, so it was the same throne. And next would come the Meiji Restoration. So as interesting as these intricate details of history are, it's imperative that we learn to derive a moral from each part of history so as to be able to learn from the past. So one moral that can be derived from the Tokugawa period is that every member of society is integral and should be treated as such. Tokugawa Ieyasu was right that the symbolic heads of our culture as well as the actual heads of state are integral to our society in our beliefs and actions. Farmers are also integral, clearly, because they feed the many people. As the respect and influence of merchants and artisans rise in the Edo period of Japan, so many technologies and amazing art pieces were created and integrated into society, which would become national treasures. At the same time, we can learn from Edo period's failings in disrespecting some, like merchants and peasants, and Eitan Hinin, and even the farmer, which, even though they were quote unquote respected, by living through the brunt of brutal taxes, not much respect was felt, even though they were able to sort of escape it at a certain point. So, and this would cause revolts and national strife. So, and then there was also the issue of Eitan Hinin. Could Tokugawa Ieyasu known that many of those shunned in the Eitan Hinin class would bolster the ranks of a crime syndicate out of seemingly no other option, which would continue to put the people of Japan in danger? Probably not, but through the moral we can learn through the successes and failings of the Edo period and learn to appreciate the virtues and vices of all. Here comes your input. How do you think the entertainers, the artisans, and the merchants of a land affect different cultures throughout history and today? Let me know, and thanks for watching for real this time.